Good day, everyone. Richard Cowperthwait for Northwest Access TV. Thanks for joining us. And we have three officials from Swanton Village, including the new police chief for Swanton Village, Matt Sullivan. Good to see you, Chief.
Thank you.
Welcome to Northwest Access TV. Village Trustee Adam Paxman, also the Police and Fire Commissioner for the trustees, and Reg Beliveau, the Swanton Village Manager. Good to see you, folks. So, Chief, Reg, I guess start with Reg, right? Big news. I mean, hiring a police chief is big news. Leonard Joey's still on hand for, what, 14 years, Reg?
Yeah, I think it was 14 years.
That's pretty long tenure.
Yeah. I think the interview process went well. I think I mentioned before that we had a 7-person interview committee.
Yeah.
Representatives from the town select board, from village trustees, from the Abnaki community, and I mean, we did a paper cut. I think we had like 9 applications, something like that, 7 or 9. We did a paper cut, got it down to 3 interviews, and Matt was obviously the top candidate.
Interesting. So, Adam, but good choice. You made a good choice.
Very good
I'm
choice.
sure.
Very good choice. I mean, just for example, if for folks who get the village report, read his report when it comes out. I mean, spot on. I mean, he's top notch. So.
Me or Adam?
Chief, a Bakersfield resident for a long time.
Yes, for more than 20 years.
Really interesting. And again, worked for Burlington PD for many years.
Yes, I'm technically still an employee of the Burlington Police
really?
Department, still burning my time,
Really?
what was remaining there. But yes,
not doing anything for them right now, or are you?
No, well, I will be in another week or so. It's just a little bit of misplanning as far as people being on vacation, so I will be acting chief for the Burlington Police Department over the weekend. I want to say it might be the 25th of February through that weekend.
Wow. Geez, I hear about, I wake up to WVMT every morning. Kurt Wright, the former Burlington City Council president, the co-host of the radio show, and a very strong backer, as I probably don't have to tell you, the Burlington PD, and he just goes crazy pretty much every morning about the situation in Burlington with the progressives not, trying to cut down the police department, I guess, successfully. But, geez, I got to think a change in job sounds to me like it was probably a pretty good change for you, but you tell me. Just sounds like Burlington PD's in a pretty tough situation these days.
They are. It's something completely foreign to me as far as my experience went in Burlington. We were, I want to say on average, the police department there was around 94, authorized strength of around 104.
Right.
There was a period of time where we did actually touch maybe 104, 105 employees.
Really? Wow.
But that was for the majority of my career. So to have this happen, I want to say they may be in the 50s effective currently, the high 50s.
That just seems, again, I'm not a police guy, but that just seems really tough. So again, having almost leaving the department, you got to feel pretty bad for your soon-to-be former colleagues, I would think, huh?
Yes, it's they have a little bit of a reprieve right now because call volume has gone down quite a bit since COVID. We've altered the response scheme in Burlington so that calls are essentially stacked in a manner of priority. So priority 1 calls officers are responding to right away, and then the lower level calls may have to wait, and then sometimes they may never receive a response just because they don't have the staffing to get to that. So previously, I want to say Burlington was pushing around 40,000 calls for service a year, maybe in 2015, 2014, in that time range. And currently, they're around 20,000 calls for service a year. So if that number gets back up, and I will say that's just calls for service. So although calls for service are drastically down in Burlington, crime is not necessarily down. Criminal incidents have stayed consistently the same, and severe criminal incidents are actually on the uptick.
Wow. So given the situation in Burlington kind of getting tougher, were you purposely looking for a new job, or did this just happen to come up and you went for it and got it, or were you kind of looking for a new job at this point in your career?
I was considering it when I was initially promoted to deputy chief in Burlington in 2020, early 2020. My plan was to stay until 25 for complete 25 years at the agency.
Yeah.
And given the criticism of the police department, and quite frankly, I mean, I don't mind the fact that citizens are engaged and they're taking a hard look at the agency.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of them really mean the best, but I just don't think it was gone about in the most responsible manner. Some of the actions taken were, quite frankly, irresponsible, and so it caused a lot of damage to the agency.
Yeah, it sounds like real tough times. I'll be interested to see if there are any changes with the election on March town meeting day. But certainly sounds like that's been a huge issue in Burlington. But in any case, you have your new job, so I mean, it sounds like a very, I guess I should go back. So deputy chief, did you make a bid for the permanent chief in Burlington?
I did not. I had put in previously when Brandon Del Pozo was hired, so I was in that process.
Oh, yeah.
And then because the processes were canceled multiple times, I don't know how many times this latest one was. I want to say maybe in early 2021 they may have opened the process, and I initially put in for that as well for the chief's job there. But then when they reopened it this last time, I did not put in.
Chief Murad, do you have decent feelings for him? Sounds like he's his job sounds like a pretty tough job these days. Sounds like a pretty decent guy, not that I've ever met him.
Chief Murad's a great guy. He means very well. He works very hard for the citizens of Burlington and the Burlington Police Department.
Well,
And
I guess I'm impressed given what's going on that he's trying to hang in there, or is hanging in there to date anyway.
he is, and he's doing a fantastic job with very little resources.
Yeah,
So
sounds like it.
he's a creative leader, and he's doing his best to make the most out of what he has.
Right. But to your new job, sounds like a very different job, going from deputy chief in the biggest police department in Vermont, obviously, to the chief of a relatively small department. So good change, or it takes some getting used to. Of course, you walk right into a homicide.
Yes.
And I guess state police are dealing with that. Are you, Swanton Village PD, have you got any involvement in that investigation now, or?
To some degree, a very limited degree.
Yeah.
Certainly, we're in a support role right now, and
Yeah.
Vermont State Police is the primary investigator.
Right.
But it is a big change. It's much different coming from an agency like Burlington, as you said, the largest municipal agency in the state of Vermont,
Yeah.
to one of the smaller municipal agencies.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that some of the problems are very similar or the same, and that staffing is an issue.
Yeah.
So the Swanton Village Police Department operates at minimum staffing all the time,
Yeah.
whereas the Burlington Police Department, we had a cushion. And in Burlington, there's a thing called the availability factor, where contractual time off allows an officer to take so much time off. And so generally an officer is available 86.5% of the time. So if you had, for example, 6 officers assigned to a shift, you might only actually have 4 officers on any given day show up. So as far as the staffing calculation went and the cap that was placed on the Burlington Police Department, I don't know that that was considered in that process. But it's something where Swanton, there is no buffer. So if somebody's assigned to a shift, if they were to call out sick, then there's nobody to fill that gap.
Oh, interesting. Reg, Adam, has the size of the Swanton Village PD, has that been pretty much the same for a number of years? Has the department grown a bit, or not particularly?
Well, no, not particularly. I mean, it's
Yeah.
always been, as far as, as long as I've been manager, it's been the same size.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why is just to keep costs down, and
Sure.
but I mean, sooner or later you get what you pay for too. I mean, if you don't, with these issues that we experienced the other day, the possibilities of inner city trying to move up in this area are quite possible. So I mean, we're going to have to be diligent, and we probably have to, get more staff in here to increase our patrols.
Yeah. And if money were no issue, Adam, I assume you'd love to have a bigger department if you didn't have to worry about money,
Yeah,
obviously, I
yeah.
guess.
It's, I mean, we've got a great crew right now. We've got a great leader, a great crew, and, we're hell-bent on taking care of the community,
Yeah.
We're gonna do whatever we can, and, it's a team effort. It's a team effort.
And of course, PD has coverage responsibilities in Swanton town as well.
Yeah, we did put in a proposal for increased coverage, but the numbers kind of scared them, I think. Initially, I mean, your first year, you gotta get another unit, right, and outfit the officers. So there was an increase the first year, but then after that, it would have came down. But I think the select board wasn't ready for for that change yet. You know, we'll put together another proposal another year when they ask us, so.
Interesting. Chief, do you see changes? You see how you cover the village and the town, and I realize you're pretty new to the job, but you anticipate making any changes in that as you get into the job, or things seem like they're working okay, or?
It's certainly something the village is willing to entertain, is my impression, as far as expanding service. And it's something that, again, comes down to a staffing issue as far as having the available staff to, for example, add another shift to the town. Currently, the town is covered for essentially one shift every day.
Is that right, one shift every day?
Yes. So if we were to expand that, we would need an additional person to fill that gap in that shift.
Right. And again, if Swanton Village PD, if they're not available, state police get the call and hopefully respond. Rich, they're kind of the.
Well, I mean, they're in the same predicament a lot of people, staffing shortages, right? So
In fact, sounds like significant staffing shortages even out of the St. Albans Barracks, Chief.
Yes, that's my understanding,
Yeah.
and that so state police covers the town. All the rest of the time, the Swanton Village Police Department does not cover the town under the contract, but Swanton Village Police Department covers the village 24 hours.
Oh, okay.
So on a call-out system also. So the officers aren't necessarily always present, but they do live in the community, so response time is very quick.
I got you. So Swanton Village PD covers the village 24 hours a day,
Yes.
but not the town.
Yep.
Interesting. Boy, policing, again, you've been in law enforcement for how many decades? Again, a long time here.
2+.
2+, wow. I can only assume just real significant changes in policing and crime, or not so much. Probably something you could talk about quite a bit, but you feel like it's a very different world these days than when you started out as an officer?
Yes, I feel that there has been a great deal of change. Certainly, officers are a little more tentative to really engage in a very proactive manner currently, given the current push for police reform.
Yeah.
So we've seen that, for example, I'll use Burlington statistics because it's something that I'm very familiar with, but for example, Burlington had around 6,000 car stops, I want to say, or traffic stops in 2015, 2016, and that's dropped as of this year. I want to say that number's around 500. So you're talking about an exponential drop in proactive enforcement of traffic violations. So it has changed quite a bit. Vermont has always been a very complicated state. Vermont protects its citizens from government intrusion, maybe more so than other states. So, for example, officers coming from other states often have a very hard time adapting to Vermont laws and criminal procedure in Vermont. So it is, it's interesting. It has changed quite a bit. I feel that unfortunately it's a little bit more of a reactive model, certainly, and there's some places to be very proactive in a creative manner.
Yeah.
As far as dealing with the opioid crisis, for example, is going to continue. It's showing no signs of letting up. I want to say overdoses have spiked this past year and the year prior, when it seemed like we were making a little bit of progress in that regard.
Let's get the sense that the opioid crisis, as you say, is still a huge issue. Seem to be almost kind of lost in the shuffle of the pandemic, or lost in terms of not getting the publicity. It just seems like people weren't thinking about this crisis so much, given all the pandemic issues, but still a big problem and getting worse.
Yes, I think it is getting worse. I think it's probably underreported. Narcan is readily available now, and so I think that a lot of overdoses are actually underreported, would be my guess. And the ones we know about certainly have skyrocketed recently. Not so much speaking about Swanton Village, although they've had their own issues, is my understanding, but certainly in Chittenden County it's been a problem.
Adam and Reg, Swanton Village folks, do you think they see the police department much differently now than they did years ago? Of course, nationally, so much controversy about police. I've got a Wall Street Journal headline from Peggy Newton, who I think is a very good columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Defund the police, ? No, fund them better. But obviously, huge controversies about police on the national level. Has that filtered down to Swanton too much, or do you get the sense villagers are still very supportive of police, or?
I mean, I get the feeling that they're supportive of the police. I know definitely the trustees are supportive of the police department. I mean, I know Chief Sullivan has only been here a little while, but I think he has the feel of what the officers are like, what their aptitudes are, and they're caring for the community.
Yeah.
I think, they maintain themselves very professionally. They treat the public very well. We went through a slow spell when Chief Stell left. They had family issues, so he was vacant, but now, Chief Sullivan's here, and I see a lot of positives now. You see another level of enthusiasm with the officers.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, I feel that the public supports them very well.
Yeah.
And I would agree. I mean, it just, people don't want to live in fear. This isn't the Wild West anymore, although it seems to be sometimes. But people don't want to live in fear. They want to be able to go to bed at night and not have to worry. And these folks do a good job. They do a really good job for us, and they do the best that they can with what they've got. And I think the people of Swanton Village and Swanton Town see that. Can they be everywhere that you want them to be? No. But at the same time, when they get the call, they're going to be there. So.
Seems like we've talked in the past, speeding, sounds like speeding's an issue everywhere, but that's certainly been an issue in the village.
Oh, absolutely.
In
Still
fact, Adam,
is.
I
Yeah.
want to talk to you about speeding.
Yeah, it's
Get him
still,
started.
it's.
Get him started, he's not gonna stop.
That's right, we got plenty of time, so go wild.
But no, and it's frustrating to see, but I mean, for me, after everything I've said over the years, it goes back to accountability. People have to hold themselves accountable, for paying attention and being careful. I mean, I live on Route 7 North, heading toward Highgate Springs, and the people that walk there, I fear for their lives, because I see these drivers, going by them and just
Is there no sidewalk
caring.
there, or just some
There's
people?
no sidewalk.
No
No.
sidewalk.
There's a portion, but not.
Well,
You run out of
Yeah.
sidewalk as
Yeah.
you go north?
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it's just, people need to start caring a little more about each other. It comes back to accountability. It's be accountable. It's take, care. Just care.
There's a lot of people that walk in Swanton.
There's a lot of people.
5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, you
Yeah.
see many of them out walking early in the morning before work.
No.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And, like I said, the police, they can only be in one place at one time. And, I've got a new appreciation, especially for the speeding side of things, because I do. Again, they can't be in the same, in two places at one time.
Yeah.
So they just, people need to hold themselves accountable. They need to slow down, care for the person that you may hit, It's going to happen, and it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah.
in the conversation about, they can't be everywhere at once. I had a revelation talking to the officers once. There's two facets. There's a call for service and patrolling, right? And when calls for service, you can elaborate more on this, Chief, but I mean, that takes a lot of time when you get a call for service. And, people don't understand that can tie an officer up to 3 hours. And then if, it's an 8-hour shift, obviously they're not out patrolling traffic. So.
Speeding, again, I mentioned off air, I used to go to Enosburg, between St. Albans and Enosburg, pretty much every day for a long time, and just so used to on Vermont 105, folks getting backed up behind me. I consider speed limits usually pretty fair, and every day I just end up pulling over at times, like in Sheldon or something, to let 10 cars, but for speeding, has that become more of an issue, Chief, or has that seemingly always been an issue? Has that gotten worse?
It's certainly been an issue. I think perhaps it has gotten worse over the course of the pandemic, because law enforcement in general has operationally pulled back a little bit, also to protect law enforcement, so they don't have the contacts necessarily, or close contacts where they might get an exposure.
Yeah.
And I think there's less worry now. that we have a better feel for the pandemic, or now we're in an endemic phase of COVID. So that's maybe not so much of a concern. Then officers have learned and adapted to be safe so that they're not getting an exposure. But for example, at Swanton Village Police Department, if we had an officer who was exposed and then other officers got sick due to an exposure to that officer,
Last thing you need.
it could really create big problems, yes, due to staffing concerns. But certainly, I mean, you touched on an interesting thing with the title of the article as far as defunding police. That's another thing that's lost in the conversation, is they want police to operate 100% perfectly 100% of the time,
Right.
which I feel like is an unrealistic expectation. There's no other profession that's held to that standard. Certainly, police do an excellent job, but it requires training on a regular basis, and it requires staff in order to train, and it requires funds in order to train police officers. So those are all things that are in the mix. And Village Manager Beliveau touched on the fact that people don't necessarily understand, if they see law enforcement shows on television, it looks like all action out on the street, but that's simply not the case. If you get an arrest, there's usually hours of paperwork associated with that, where the officer is not out on the street, and that varies from state to state. Certainly, other states have probably more efficient systems as far as processing individuals into the system during an arrest, but Vermont is very time consuming. There's a very high standard placed on officers as far as their paperwork goes, and it is very demanding. I would say probably up to 80% of their time is spent on paperwork rather than actual proactive law enforcement.
Is that 80%?
I believe that,
Wow.
from my experience.
Well, that's scary. I hate paperwork. That's I was going to ask you about paperwork, but well, it just sounds really discouraging. I got to think most police officers would much rather be out doing, active patrolling, or probably doing anything but paperwork, I would guess. But boy, that's a scary stat to hear.
But there are some creative ways around it that I'm looking to hopefully address, and we're hopefully going to hire more part-time officers. I've had 4 Burlington Police Department employees reach out looking for part-time
really?
employment.
Wow.
So if I can onboard them, it will really expand the pool. And then there are other, without necessarily adding an additional permanent employee, there are programs such as the Governor's Highway Safety Detail that provides funds for patrols specific to traffic enforcement, and we can get more officers out on the road engaging in that enforcement without necessarily being a financial burden to the village.
Right. Speaking of speeding, going over the years, it seems like I haven't heard this too much lately, but once in a while, going back a few years, one of my friends got stopped for speeding. Hey, I'm sure it's a quota issue. I wasn't going that much over the speed limit. Are quotas, I hear that once in a while. Do some police departments have quotas, or is that?
No, that's not a practice.
Urban legend?
Yes, it should be. I mean, a quota would possibly motivate an officer to stretch the rules a little bit. And, an officer is required to have reasonable suspicion to stop an operator of a motor vehicle that there's a violation of the motor vehicle law. And so that is a requirement. So if you had a quota where officers were held to a standard where if they just didn't see something, they were then encouraged to actually stop people when they necessarily did not meet that standard of reasonable suspicion, that would be hugely problematic. So I have never seen that in practice. Certainly the Governor's Highway Safety Detail asks that you do get so many contacts, they call it, per hour, but generally speaking, if you go out on the roadways, there are plenty of violations. It's interesting that currently there's another discussion regarding non-public safety stops. Certainly the Chittenden County State's Attorney put out a memo on that.
Sarah George, I was going to ask you about that.
Yes, and Judge Coopersmith put out a memorandum on a decision, and he commented on it also. And I think the problem is with some of these things is, for example, if headlights are out on a car, where do you draw the line as far as public safety goes? So at night, if someone's driving without their headlights on, generally officers are trained to look at that as an indicator of possibly someone being intoxicated behind the wheel. So they'll look to stop the car and see, because it is a technical violation, and then get FaceTime with the operator and see if they make more observations that the operator is intoxicated and driving impaired. And they use that to try to address that public safety issue. So at what point really is that line drawn, as far as it may seem like, oh, a taillight's out or a vehicle's not inspected, but there are other things that play into those motor vehicle stops.
Interesting. But yeah, no, that sounds like that's a big issue. I hear about that issue all the time. And our officers, I think you might have touched on this, is that are they just being less aggressive at times, just for fear of getting, I don't know, criticism for being too aggressive? Do they feel like officers maybe are backing off too much? It does sound like it's a fine line there, maybe.
I think so. Certainly my experience in Burlington is that officers feel that they're under so much scrutiny that they can't do their jobs the way they would like to. For example, going back 20 years, I would tell trainees, listen, it's a good idea to try to get 2 motor vehicle stops in a shift, because it's reasonable that you might observe at least 2 violations. But now officers have pulled back so much that it then allows people, we were talking about the speeding issue, if there's no enforcement, people will tend to drive faster. Just generally, not everybody, as you stated, when your commute to Enosburg, you were not driving over the speed limit, but certainly there are people that will.
Yeah, interesting.
Elaborate a little bit on the subject of the paperwork. There were comments in I think open session and the trustees meeting and in the select board meeting about when we have an arrest, how do we know the final resolve of that arrest? So there's when you have a lot of time when you're trying to do your paperwork, obviously you're not out patrolling. So then the criticism is, well, you're not out patrolling, you're not stopping these speeders. So again, it falls back to, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on it, but if, you've got the paperwork that has to get done and you got to do your follow-up to figure out where this case actually ended up, so you can notify the people that are interested in it, but also they complain about not having enough patrol out or not stopping enough vehicles, which you can't unless it's a probable cause. So, where does it end in that conversation? It's probably staffing. Getting more part-timers, more staffing, more hours of patrol. You gotta have your cake and eat it too, right?
Yeah, we talked about staffing. So again, Swanton Village PD, I think, Reg, we talked about it yesterday. You're not quite at full staffed, Chief, at this point, or how?
No, my understanding is we're down 1 full-time position, and then we have recently lost a few part-timers, so we don't have as many part-timers to fill open shifts. And again, if an officer wants to take a vacation day or they're sick, that creates a gap in shift that needs to be covered. So it'll certainly help building out our part-time staffing to hopefully add to those shifts. It is interesting. It's different. It's a foreign concept to me. It's almost the sheriff's model of law enforcement as far as engaging in contracts with other municipalities in order to be able to take on those or expand your law enforcement role in the community.
Right, Reg, I guess given the staffing issues, Swanton Village PD again covers obviously the village and Swanton Town, has never gone past that. Of course, I was surprised. I talked to the Highgate Town Clerk. I guess their contract came up in St. Albans City, as the chief referenced. I guess got another year, but had no competition. The Sheriff's Department didn't even try to get a Highgate back, apparently.
Yeah, we were in the middle of flux during that time period when the request came out, and I did talk to the chief about it, and it just wasn't a good time for us to put in a bid yet. So, if it comes up again next year, hopefully that we'll have the opportunity to put in a bid for it.
Oh, is that right? So you would definitely consider that?
Absolutely. We're even with the airport project, that we're working with them on, we're close neighbors.
Sure.
And to us, it makes sense, our proximity to Highgate. So, yeah, I'd be interested in it. I don't know, talk to the commissioner.
That's right. What do you think, Commissioner? Would you, if you had the staffing?
Absolutely, yeah.
Can you picture going for more than Highgate, or Highgate would be the natural one, I guess?
It all depends, It would all depend on the chief. That's, he's going to run the show, and he's going to make the best decision possible for his group.
Chief, speaking of Bakersfield, Franklin County Sheriff's Department has a contract with Bakersfield, do they, or is that just state police?
I'm not sure if they do. I know state has
sure.
been up there and handled incidents in
Yeah.
Bakersfield
So
previously.
not sure about sheriff's.
So I'm not sure if the
either.
sheriff's department has a contract. I
Yeah.
know that Bakersfield has talked about contracting, especially speeding is one of the issues there
I think
also.
they have maybe over the years from time to time, but I'm not sure about right now.
Right, but I haven't seen a great deal of enforcement in Bakersfield,
Interesting.
generally speaking.
Franklin County Sheriff Roger Longchamp, do you know the sheriff?
I don't know him personally,
Yeah.
but I do know of him.
Yeah.
So from him being a member of the community for so many years.
Yeah,
But no, I have not yet met the sheriff.
I suspect you'll bump into him at some point probably.
Yes, I knew the previous sheriff, Robert Norris.
Yeah, now, of course,
So-
a state representative these days, of course.
Yes.
Speaking of the legislature, it makes me think of the qualified immunity issue. Sounds like another issue I hear on morning radio all the time with the radio folks voicing a lot of concern about that. You want to talk about that a little bit? It sounds like again, the morning radio shows had some police folks on who just sound like they're extremely concerned about this issue and the fact that it may get some, I guess it's getting a look in the legislature, but can you talk about that a little bit? Does that sound like not a good idea? Is it a complicated issue or?
Sure, no, I can. It is somewhat of a complicated issue in that qualified immunity, right? And it's exactly what it says. It's qualified immunity. It's not absolute immunity. So
Okay.
you have prosecutors and judges that enjoy absolute immunity regarding their decisions. Law enforcement officers do not have that, and we work in such a high liability profession
Yeah.
that you really don't, in some sense, you don't have discretion in certain circumstances. So that's one of the things we were looking at in data as far as where does non-discretionary issues arise that essentially forces the officer's hand to take action in certain circumstances. But I think it's dangerous. Law enforcement is down in general as far as even entertaining, limiting qualified immunity. I don't know how you do it just for law enforcement only versus the other professions that enjoy qualified immunity. I think you would have to look at the whole group of professions as a whole, not just limit it to law enforcement. The other issue is, what is law enforcement going to have to do then at that point? I want to understand what the legislature is considering is based off the Colorado model, where there might be a $20,000 cap on personal liability. But even then, is an officer going to have to go out and purchase liability insurance? Are they even going to want to take on that additional liability, even though they already operate in this very litigious environment? So I think it's a bad idea. We're struggling to keep law enforcement officers in the state of Vermont. I want to say we're down under 1,000 total for the whole state of Vermont.
Really? Under
and-
1,000?
Yes, and we've had net losses year after year. So the way the state's set up, there's only 2 police academy classes. You can only recruit so many officers and get them trained. And then that whole process, at least in Burlington, would take almost a year before an officer was ready to act as what we called a solo officer in the field, responding to calls by themselves.
Is that right? Almost a year?
That's correct.
Wow.
So the whole process of hiring somebody, sending them to the police academy, getting them out through field training, successfully completing field training. And I would add that in Burlington, only about 50% of hires successfully completed that whole process, as far
Really?
as the hiring process, the police academy, and then field training.
And the ones who didn't, are they gone at some point? I mean, they don't stick with the department, or?
They don't stick with the department. Usually they may be able to find employment as a law enforcement officer in other agencies. I know
Yeah.
some of them have previously.
Huh.
But as far as qualified immunity goes, I think that it's necessary for law enforcement. Again, that we're not operating in a sterile environment. Officers are responding to things that are very unpredictable. They're having to make split-second decisions in tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving circumstances, and to hold them to a standard of perfection, essentially, is completely unrealistic. And I would say that my experience, certainly in Burlington, and my exposure to the officers in Swanton so far, is that we have very, very high caliber officers in this state that tend to make very good decisions the majority of the time. I would say probably over 99% of the time, which is a fantastic result when you're talking about the circumstances that they're forced to deal with. You know, it's not anything like a surgeon going into an operating room where it's a little bit more of a controlled environment, right? So certainly they deal with some bad circumstances also as far as emergency room visits, but it's not like you have to worry about everything around you all the time. where law enforcement does. And again, they're put in these circumstances where they're responding to people's behavior, and I think that's also lost in the discussion. I want to say previously somebody talked about taking responsibility for behavior also, and I think that's lost in this general police reform discussion nationally also, is that people need to take responsibility for their own behavior, and officers a lot of times are responding to behavior, especially when you're looking at use of force incidents.
Yeah. Good. So the training issue, if you're hiring, again, you need a full-time officer. If you hire someone who's from another department, a regular officer, does that officer still have to do additional training with a new job or not? Does it just depend on that officer's background?
They would. It depends on the officer. Certainly, if you're hiring an officer from out of state, they would have to go through a full field training process.
Okay.
I think you might be able to get away with a slightly abbreviated field training process, and that varies also from agency to agency, how long that field training process is.
Yeah.
But certainly, for example, in Swanton Village, some of the officers who are interested in employment have many, many years' experience. And so for them, it would be more of an orientation. They know how to do the job. They just need to learn how to do it in Swanton Village.
Yeah.
And again, most of those officers also are very community oriented. All the officers in Swanton Village that I've met are very community oriented officers, and that's been a focus of law enforcement, community policing for more than 20 years. I mean, that was my whole career. I was embedded in an agency that embraced community policing and was one of the leaders in the country.
Really? Can you talk, I hear that term, talk about community policing. What exactly do you mean by that? And is that what you're trying to do or do in Swanton?
Yes, absolutely. So community policing is based on the concept that you need to work with the community to identify the issues that the community has of concern. Primarily for Swanton Village, it's traffic enforcement and drug enforcement. But again, solving issues with community members rather than just engaging in a unilateral manner. You have to engage with the community, you have to realize and know what the issues are for the community, and then create a plan to address those issues, ideally together with the community.
Right. I guess state police, and again, it sounds like maybe every community goes through this. I know state police in Richford have been trying to do something like that. Seems like I've read stories about that in Richford, but again, that may be common for just about every community. So any thoughts in Swanton just taking over there? Do you hope to get the community more involved in helping you folks, helping the PD? Any thoughts? Can you get the community more engaged, do you think, in what you guys are up to and what you're trying to do?
Yes, I think we can. I think there's certainly areas that we can interact with on a more regular basis, as far as create platforms. I mean, obviously social media is a huge thing for many community members now. And so that certainly could be addressed. I know Swanton Village Police Department already has a Facebook platform that they have used previously. I am not a huge social media guy, so that's a little bit outside
I'm sure you're way ahead of me.
Ballpark, but in any case, it's a critical aspect to community policing, as far as again engaging with the community, figuring out what those issues are, and then hopefully coming to some sort of resolution that's satisfactory for the community. But certainly, community members, when they see something, they should say something. This latest issue that happened last week is a perfect example. I mean, community members, especially being in a small community, everyone knows everyone else, and so there's a lot of information out there. I'm sure a lot of people know a lot about the events that transpired last week, and so anybody with information would be great to share that with Vermont State Police.
And again, reference to the homicide in Vermont State Police, the lead agency, they're the folks dealing with the homicide investigation pretty much.
They are. So we were the initial responders to the scene, and then we turned it over to Vermont State Police. We could tell that it was going to be very complicated. It wasn't as straightforward as the previous homicide in 2020, where the individual in that incident was on scene, and there was plenty of evidence associated with that. This was going to require a much more extensive investigation, and we just don't have the resources. Again, talking about paperwork, we go back to that. There were many detectives involved in writing paperwork, writing warrants, and that sort of thing initially from the get-go with this, where we just don't have the manpower in Swanton Village Police Department to dedicate officers to things like that. For example, the officers, the initial responders to that scene had worked the night before and literally had very little sleep and were back on scene for many hours, where I had to manage how much time they were actually working in a circumstance like that. So it's difficult. It's different. It's definitely an adjustment for me.
Yeah.
Whereas in Burlington, we had teams where we could rotate people in and out, and so you had more consistent staffing, being able to throw resources at an issue like this. But certainly Vermont State Police has those resources, and they're doing a fantastic job.
Right. Again, we're back to money issues. I'm a longtime St. Albans City resident, and one of the issues on the ballot March 1st in the city, shall voters appropriate the sum of $100,000 to fund an additional NCSS crisis intervention specialists to work directly with the St. Albans Police Department. If money were no object, would that be something that would sound good for Swanton PD, but not even close to being able to do that money-wise? Reg or Adam?
I think it would be a good idea for some of the mental health issues that we may come across.
Right.
When people are in crisis, they'll act differently. If we had that type of a service embedded, I think it would be a value to our department.
Right.
If cost was no objective.
But you just don't have that luxury.
No, I mean,
Not at this point. I mean,
I think we have contacts for people if if we're up against a situation and stuff. But the immediacy of the situation, not someone that's not embedded, but you show up and there's now you're confronted with something you can't. You identify it as a mental health situation, then you call the services, and it takes time and it just drags it on. Yeah. So if you had somebody that was embedded with the department, that would be a lot quicker. Call for service.
I guess St. Albans City PD, I think, already has one person embedded, and I guess trying to fund a second person. And CSS being, of course, Northwest Counseling and Support Services. But yeah, I love, with all the controversy about police at the national level, love it when I hear, hey, police don't need to respond to send a mental health worker, to a crisis situation, I suspect sometimes that would work out just fine. Other times I suspect that would work out pretty badly, but again,
and we're lucky. I mean, up in Swanton, we've got, full-time SRO officer, at the high school, and a part-timer, correct?
Yes.
And, I mean, just helping the kids to begin with.
Yeah.
Showing the positive attitude and everything that, they need to grow up. That's going to help them, and in the long run, it's going to help the community.
I think that having the SRO in the school, I think it gives the students an opportunity to see a police officer in their environment and understand that is a person that is there that could be a help to them, rather than they're being arrested by them.
Right.
So I mean, initially the first reaction is these are good people. They, don't always want to arrest you. They're actually there to help you.
Of course, SROs, like it seems like everything else these days, has become pretty controversial. In fact, Maple Run School Board covering St. Albans City, Town, Fairfield, and BFA. And there was an SRO. In fact, the former sheriff, Roger Langevin, was the former SRO at the St. Albans Town Elementary School. And when he was running for sheriff, I love running into knew a mother who had kids here saying, hey, I like Roger Langevin, but I'm not going to vote for him for sheriff because I don't want to lose him as an SRO. But that's become controversial, seemingly like everything else. Chief, you think SRO is good idea? You think that's
I do. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
So you've touched on a couple different things here in that you mentioned this, what St. Albans City is doing, asking for another mental health worker embedded in the agency, and I think it's a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
Burlington, for example, had the street outreach team since, I want to say, 2000, and so they were a rapid response, and if there was no safety issue, they would be the primary responders to deal with mental health issues, specifically focused more so perhaps on the marketplace, but also they would respond to other areas. But then we expanded that program, and they were embedded in the Burlington Police Department, and they would really address some of these issues on a proactive basis. They would develop relationships with clients.
Right.
They would know if a client was decompensating or behaving in a different manner, and they were able to proactively come up with some sort of solution to address that prior to the point of law enforcement needing to engage with that subject. So I feel like it's a great program. One of the part-time officers that we recently extended an offer to, that's his focus primarily in Burlington. He's a community sport liaison. And we pitched similar to the Eugene, Oregon, I want to say cahoots model of adding 6 community support liaisons to the Burlington Police Department, having them embedded with an officer with a like mindset, and then allowing, so you would have co-responders, an officer and a social worker, essentially. They would respond to an incident and allow that social worker to take the lead, but have the support from law enforcement in the background to ensure their safety.
Sounds like an ideal situation if you have the funding to do that, huh?
Right, and you hit the nail on the head as far as, they're not going to respond. A lot of these social workers will not respond to certain situations because it is not safe for them to do so. So that model was actually tamped down. The City Council in Burlington only allowed 3, I want to say, in total. So that's what we ended up with in Burlington. But it's an extremely valuable program, and they do a lot of really good work. That's being embedded with law enforcement, but again focusing more on the social work aspect and taking a proactive response to link people with services that they need. That the law enforcement doesn't necessarily have time to do, because they're more focused on looking at things through the lens of whether or not a crime has been committed and holding people accountable for committing crimes.
Out of curiosity, did you have dealings yourself with Burlington City Council over the years on various issues, or not? Was that...
Not so much the City Council. I provided a lot of support to Chief Murad in the background. He was more the since my time as deputy chief there, he was really the person who was having a lot of that interaction. But certainly I had the historical knowledge, being in the police department for as long as I was in Burlington, so I would provide support for him.
Of course, there's a Burlington Police Commission also,
yes.
Correct?
So I had a lot of interaction with the police commission in Burlington on a regular basis. And there again, it's a body that really, I feel like their heart is in the right place. They're doing good work, and they're actually, I will give them a lot of credit for taking the initiative and seeking out and engaging in training. I mean, that was one of the biggest issues, is that people who don't know a lot about law enforcement, it's very hard to get that law enforcement perspective. And I think best practice for police commissioners is to do ride-alongs, learn what officers do, learn the difference between responding to the scene and actually all the paperwork that's involved on the backside, so that they have a really good feel for what these incidents are like in person. And so they're doing a good job. They're engaging more in that manner to learn about how law enforcement is done in Burlington. And again, you mentioned SROs. I'd like to touch on that also, because again, things are being painted with a very broad brush, right? Nationally, these movements are coming out saying that the school to prison pipeline is something you hear as a catchphrase with SROs. Well, if people did their research, certainly the SROs in Burlington almost never referred students to the criminal justice system. It was always alternative or restorative justice systems is where students were referred to deal with problems if it wasn't handled internally by the school administration themselves. So the SRO program is invaluable. Village Manager Beliveau touched on it, that those officers up at the school are creating relationships with kids. And in fact, my first week, it was one of my first days, we had that really cold snap at the beginning of January. I had to go buy a car battery, and I was in an auto parts store, and the young man working behind the counter asked me if I knew one of the SROs up at MVU, and I told him yes. I had just met him recently, and he said he really does such great work with the kids, and is invaluable, essentially, was his opinion. And this was clearly a student who had gone through the school system, and the SRO had built that relationship with that student.
Interesting. It's a little frustrating, is probably not the right word, but I mean, a huge change for you, obviously, coming from deputy chief of the biggest department in Vermont to chief of a relatively small department with obviously way fewer resources. That a little frustrating at times, or I guess a different world for you? Huh?
I don't know that I found it frustrating yet, so to speak, but certainly I have to wear more hats than I did previously. I was at the level that I was at in the Burlington Police Department. It was much more almost a consultant level position where I would guide people essentially, and I would do the research and render opinions on certain topics, but certainly I had people who were doing most of the work. For example, Burlington Police Department has their own identification unit that consists of civilians that process evidence and handle the evidence in the evidence room down there. That job falls on me at the Swanton Village Police Department. So I have to wear many more hats, certainly, and it's a little bit refreshing, quite honestly, to get back to the more boots on the ground law enforcement. But I certainly have more balls in the air, so to speak, at Swanton Village.
But to some extent, I guess, brings you back to kind of a situation earlier in your career, I guess, just to some extent in terms of what you have to do.
Yes, and I really enjoy the learning curve to some extent. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly I've done a lot over the course of my career in Burlington, from being a police officer out in the field, a detective, and a supervisor for many, many years. And in Swanton Village, I wear all those hats again. I'm responding to calls myself. I'm supervising the team of officers that work in Swanton Village Police Department. So in that sense, it is refreshing, and it's a little bit of a learning curve, really.
And then I was going to ask you about your typical day. I use the word extremely loosely, obviously, but I was just wondering, can you get away from administrative? You do get out of the office once in a while, or is that kind of tough to do?
I haven't had much of a chance yet, as much as I would like to. But certainly I have had to respond to quite a few calls myself. Many more than I have in several years with the Burlington Police Department. So in that sense, I have been tasked with a lot of administrative tasks recently, and it may just be the beginning of the year also, as far as communicating with the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, making sure training records are straight with the police department, and just engaging in those administrative tasks to run a law enforcement agency takes a lot of time and energy.
Adam, we talked about obviously speeding concerns. What other from Swanton Village residents? Again, speeding and drugs, are they kind of the two big things?
Yeah, the speeding, the traffic, the drugs. I actually spoke with someone over the weekend, and they were concerned with what had happened last week, and
Sure.
Because of the proximity of Swanton between Montreal and Boston, is this just going to continue? I can't answer that.
Yeah.
I can't answer that. I don't know that Chief can answer that. It's, it may be a one and done thing. We don't know. But, we've got a great force in Swanton Village, and, they know. They'll take care of us. I have no doubt they'll take care of us.
Yeah. Boy, the border issue's been a tough issue. Obviously, nothing I have to tell any of you folks. Obviously, we might have touched on it yesterday, but just local businesses obviously being hurt by the border, having been effectively closed for quite a while. Chief, is that actually a bit of a benefit from a law enforcement point of view? Is that not a bad thing to have the border kind of closed, to have just not too much traffic coming across? Is that a bit of a benefit or not? Not particularly.
It's tough for me to say, given my lack of tenure at Swanton Village so far, but certainly Swanton Village works closely with CBP, and so it is an issue for CBP as far as border, and also they're suffering a drain on resources due to what's going on at the southern border currently.
Right.
So normally their staffing it would be much larger, and their staffing is greatly depleted because they've deployed those resources to the southern border. So certainly they are looking to work with local law enforcement to assist them in their mission as well. But as far as the border itself goes, I don't know. I think that historically speaking, my understanding from talking to the officers is you certainly have issues associated with, because we are just south of Montreal, an extremely large city. You do have issues with people running drugs over the border, and probably other things in addition to that. But certainly it's an issue, and I'm just getting my feet wet as far as all that goes in Swanton Village.
Sure. I think we touched on this a little bit. I know a couple times I spent some time going around with state police in a cruiser, and actually with former Sheriff Norris one time. Spent a few hours with the sheriff. Is that something you've done in Swanton, giving folks a chance to, jump into a cruiser and see life of an officer for a few hours? Has that happened before?
Yeah, we've done it with, new select board members.
Yeah,
They want to, because when we offer the
Right.
contract, they want to see what's happening.
yeah,
I know in the past, Adam has gone with the police department.
yeah,
Being on the fire department for as many years as I have,
Right.
I knew a lot of the officers anyway.
right.
So I haven't done any ride-alongs with them, but obviously I'm sensitive to what they do have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Adam, have you been out with?
I've been on a couple rides.
Couple rides.
It's very interesting. I don't know how these guys do it. I really don't.
Yeah,
I really don't. I mean, the calmness, the patience, even the questions they ask sometimes they're not the easiest questions to answer, but they do it in such a professional manner that they get the answers they need.
yeah.
It's truly amazing, and I guess I'm biased because, it's our department, but these guys are great guys. These folks are great folks, and, we should thank our lucky stars that we've got them, protecting us.
Chief, one of the issues before Swanton Village voters, which I suspect is whether voters will authorize the Board of Trustees to allow the retail sale of cannabis in the village of Swanton. I'd take a wild guess that you're maybe not too high on that proposal, or am I wrong? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it can be problematic, certainly, that there
Yeah.
could be issues associated with it.
Sounds
Certainly,
like the big concern that the governor certainly talked about a lot of times is the difficulty at this point to, if a driver is high on drugs, just being able to determine the impairment issue. And it sounds like that's still, as opposed, I guess, to alcohol, which it sounds like is relatively cut and dried. Is that still a huge concern, just to be able to tell if someone's high on drugs?
yes, I think to be able to tell that they're impaired to the point
Right.
of some sort of legal limit, certainly,
Right.
it would be difficult. And I don't know where the state is on that, quite frankly.
Right.
I know we have drug recognition experts who are trained officers in drug recognition and impaired
Mhm.
driving, but those are few and far between. And it's an extensive training, and it's very difficult for officers to complete and then retain their certification.
Yeah.
So certainly, as far as commercial or recreational cannabis goes, I think there are a host of issues that could be associated with that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It seems to me, my impression is certainly that it's coming, whether law enforcement likes it or not.
Yeah.
But there will most likely be issues associated with that.
Yeah.
There are quite a few, as far as them, these places being a cash business. They've always talked about marijuana being a gateway drug. I don't know that that's the case or not necessarily, but certainly there are a host of issues that will have to be worked through at a state level, not to mention the fact simply regulation alone. I don't know if it's going to fall on DLC. I know in other states, Department of Liquor Control enforcement officers or their peers in other states have taken on that responsibility, but certainly they would have to build out staffing also to address retail cannabis establishments. So I'd have to see exactly what that looks like, and unfortunately, work our way through it as it comes.
Here you down to about a minute and a half. Adam, you feel Swanton Village PD in pretty good hands here? You got your new chief, but
We're in very good hands.
yeah,
We're in very good hands. It's Chief Sullivan is, he's a breath of fresh air, and he's going to make a lot of good things happen, and this community is going to be very appreciative that he's here.
yeah. Reg, your thoughts? Again, you've been dealing with the PD for what, about over a
11 years.
decade at this point, huh?
Yeah. I mean, I really feel bad for Burlington, not really, that we still hold him. I'm really happy he applied. Yeah, it's been, so far so good. It's been a pleasure working with him. I like the collaboration. I like the confidence that they have in me as the manager. I always have an open door policy, so a lot of the officers just come in and, just talk, shoot the breeze and whatnot. But, yeah, it's a good group of folks. I think, we should be proud of our department. A lot of them are local grown guys, so they grew up in the community and they know the community and they know where the bad spots are, so. I'm optimistic and very hopeful for the future.
Chief, give you the last word in just a couple seconds here, but again, a significant change in your law enforcement life, but sounds like you're looking forward to it and off to a good start, I guess, huh?
I certainly am. I'm looking forward to the challenge. It's
Yeah.
it's much different than what I've been used to for the last 20 plus years, but I am really looking forward to it, and it's been a nice change so far.
Thanks a lot. We wish you well. Again, Swanton Village's new police chief, Matt Sullivan, Adam Paxman, Swanton Village trustee, Reg Beliveau, Swanton Village manager. I'm Richard Cowperthwait. Thanks for joining us on Northwest Access TV. See you next time. Thanks to producers Alan and Roger. See ya.